cloud. All right, great. So this session is being recorded as always, because we'll upload it to our YouTube channel for more people to benefit. If you don't want your video to be recorded, just switch off your video. That's the soundest advice I can give you. But even if your video is recorded, your name will not be present on it as far as I'm aware. So all good. So basically, it's lecture 5. And I wanted us to focus on all those wonderful things we just talked about culture and individual differences and teams, and also about change, because this is one of the things we did not cover in the previous 4 lectures. And in the previous 4 lectures, what we did cover is history, second lecture about personality and context, third week was coaching, last week was all about relationships, and today it emerges. So the plan is, let's sec, let somebody in, done, is reflections on the journey so far, talk about changes, maybe a little bit on careers, and also teams and culture. So we already covered this question together. Love that gives though. So personality assessment started in ancient China, so thousands of years ago. It took us a couple of thousand years ago to arrive at an understanding there's pretty much 3 levels. There's the disposition trait of what you like, behavior, what you do, and the maladaptive response, what you do too much. So not doing yourself too many favors. And there's also other fun things like 360 assessment, how other people see you. It took us that amount of time to arrive at the big 5. Though interestingly enough, when we started in ancient China, they also had 5 factors of character, I believe, on which they were selecting elephant trainers. So it depends how you argue. Did it really arrive? Did we arrive on the big 5 in the 80s, or actually it was always lingering there? Because there's also 5 touch points in the yin and yang, the 5 elements. So there's quite a lot of commonality. Or maybe humans just like 5. Every time you read LinkedIn, like top 5 tips, maybe there's some relationship with it. Basically, the 5 factors, which we currently have, by the way, might be 6. That's why it's personality science. It evolves with time. You have neuroticism, which is a propensity for negative emotions and propensity to feel more risk. You have extroversion, which is positive emotions and need for stimuli. You have openness, which is all about curiosity and exploration. Agreeableness, which is attitude towards other people, and importance you place on relationship, conscientiousness, strength of drive and purpose. So you have the big 5. Then, because somebody had nothing better to do with their evenings, we got the big 2. So we found out that you have plasticity, so high extroversion, high openness connects. And you have stability, which is high conscientiousness, high agreeableness, and low neuroticism. So it's kind of like you have the big 5 and you have big 2. All data is normed. So when we talk about personality, we always look how you compare to the population. So of people who've done the assessment before. So if you score 95th percentile, that means you're in top 5%. So more fast than others. If you score bottom 5th percentile, you're not particularly fast, because 95% of the population, more or less, score higher than you in that trait. But when we talk about percentiles and numbers, they're not exactly like weight or measurement in centimeters. It's not as definite. So it's not like putting your head on a pair of scales. So as you remember from the first lecture, when one of the Cattels, because there was 2 major Cattels in history of psychometry, proposed to a major UK university to start up a psychometrics laboratory at the end of 19th century, they said, it's actually a really naughty thing you're gonna do, because you're proposing to put a human soul on a pair of scales. So for some reason, this concept of scales and psychometry is also quite key. But it's not the way it works. When we talk about personality, it's more squishy. So because of context, as we just discussed, culture, demands on the team culture, organizational, potentially more wider culture effects, they all squeeze our personality and circumstances. And we had a whole lecture on this. But whenever we talk about personality, please remember it's squishy numbers, not definite numbers. And because they're squishy, it gives us room to play. So we can develop our personalities, and we do change with time, but to an extent. So you can change up to like 1 standard deviation, your personality over the way you age. So you can go from being like the most neurotic to being more neurotic than most, or from more neurotic to being neurotic as pretty much an average. So it's, or from being very introverted to being introverted. So there's only so much change you can do, and so much change of your personality does. So it's important to play to your strengths, but also to know when you have energy to monitor your personality a bit more and develop. So what you can do to develop your personality, things like therapy has been shown to help, like reduce your neuroticism, increase your extroversion, but you can also, let's say, personality and coaching. And the reason is why I have the light bulb there, because it's one of my favorite psychology jokes. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Any answers?
It depends.
Ah, nice, Karen. That's a good modification there. It's one, but the light bulb needs to want to change, but it depends. So it's actually now a double barrel joke. So thank you for that. But to me, when it comes to personality, light bulb joke is applicable, but I also like to compare personality with breath. So in a way that we can either breathe and be aware of our breath. So if we center ourselves, we can control our breath, we control our rate, we become very conscious of it, or we can just breathe and be, let's say, focused on something else like presenting. We're still breathing. It doesn't stop us from breathing, thank God. So I feel it's the same with personality. You can either be aware of your personality and how you're reacting and how you're behaving, or you can just kind of let it run wild. But this is why it's important to me. It's kind of self-awareness. It's more about self-centering, observing yourself with empathy and interest. So hence, I feel there's quite a bit of parallel between personality development and, for example, mindfulness, because you become more aware of your thought processes and reactions. And then when you do interact with other humans, we covered the element of respect, which is all about everyone sees the world differently. Like that's a key thing to remember. Nobody sees the world like you. Nobody. Because we all have a slightly different perspective on the world. And if you have really strong personality differences with others, you might have bigger differences in world perception. So just be really conscious of that. And I'm not even getting into memory, which is a whole different kettle of fish, which is also not particularly reliable. So having that at the back of your mind can be useful. And appreciate that all personalities have something to offer. That's one of my key hobby horses. Like, extroversion is not the best, neither is high openness. They all have something to offer, and they can all be overdone. So similarly, you can overdo neuroticism through better risk awareness, more inclined towards it, potentially better, and have something to offer. Similarly, high extroversion can be overdone because people can appear as needy or smothering with too much energy and overloading others. So keep in mind when we talk about personality, every personality trait has something to give, and everything can be overdone. And benefit of doubt, because of this difference of perspectives, rather than thinking this person is doing exactly this to get on my nerves, well, we think, well, maybe they're just not aware of it, and maybe they're on a different trajectory, and it's worth asking that and exploring. So now, by the way, before we get into change, which is a new topic, does anybody have any questions or any reflections on what we covered so far in the course? Well, I counted to 20, so that gave enough opportunity. But let me change the question. What particularly stood out for you from the course so far? And Per just let me know that he apparently met David Bowie, which is really interesting. Per, can you tell us about meeting David Bowie? Because we're what?
It was actually really dull. I was working as a guard at the show he was doing here in Oslo, and I got to sort of look after him. He was actually really short. I always thought of him as a tall guy, but he was actually really, really short and stressed.
Right, short and stressed.
Yeah, so that's his personality for you.
Thank you for such an executive summary.
I met
Hi, Nick. I met Johnny Vegas.
Really?
Yeah. And if I had a notion about what his personality might have been like from seeing on TV, where I met him was very unexpected because it was in a ski dome in Yorkshire, which didn't tally with my sense of what his personality was about. So it was very, very cold. We were up there, my son was up there practicing his snowboarding, and Johnny Vegas was there. I have to say, he wasn't in skis, he was just hovering around. So I don't know if he was doing a celebrity thing. So I guess it says something about maybe about what one might learn from this is, do behaviors really kind of always reflect what we think is someone's personality? So I think for me, apart from the interesting stuff around historical and how really going back how long we've been playing around with this, or people have been playing around with it. And I think that's interesting. I think around the whole notion about whether it's fixed or there's a plasticity to it and whether we change it. And I think what's more interesting last week and this week, your references quite often to therapy and like today to mindfulness is this ability for us to sort of stop and look and say, what are my attributes? What is my personality? And I think that's really quite interesting because obviously in my world, which is the therapy world, we're constantly trying to change and alter people's behavioral strategies in order that they can have long-lasting cognitive shifts, which might make significant shifts around their personality. And then the other bit is, again, growing interest is therapist attributes, their own. And I've mentioned, I think, this to you before. So there's been a really interesting study looking at CBT and the Big Five, and showed that those who scored high on agreeableness correlated with poorer outcomes around CBT. And if anyone knows CBT, you'll know it's the most unagreeable type of therapeutic approach, particularly if you're doing behavioral aspects of it, where you expect people to go and do some really, really difficult things, like, sit in a cafe with a load of strangers for 2 hours when they're, acutely stressed. So yeah, it's been an interesting few weeks, and certainly got me still thinking. I think there's a further study to be done around those attributes of therapists.
Yeah, and especially different personality traits of therapists and how successful their therapies are.
Yeah.
So if you're in agreeableness, CBT doesn't work maybe because you don't hold the feet to the fire of the client too much because you're actually more empathetic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, and then that raises whole issues because some of the things you've touched on about many of the people on this forum who are very experienced in how to use personality measurement, both for selection, for team building, and all those things. When you start to get into the area of psychotherapeutics, and there are difficult groups like herding cats, how you start to play that in. We interview a lot of therapists and counsellors. We don't, if they were being interviewed for managers' jobs and leadership jobs, we'd be quite okay about sending them a battery of measures, but it's not something that we look at in terms of therapists.
It's interesting would be to look at that and therapist personalities, and if it's different or similar to the client, does they have more or less effect? That would be also interesting to find out.
Yeah.
I also found it interesting that we talked, this is what I find so fascinating about personality. It's at the same time, it's not that correlated with behavior because of these changes to circumstances, and we're highly adaptable as creatures. But at the same time, when it comes to defining somebody's personality, we can define them by very limited interaction with them. So it's almost an interesting combination that we have so much flexibility, but
Yeah.
when it comes to actually defining others, we immediately just lock onto particular traits and go, that's them.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. And we do, even those of us who don't work in the world of metrics, we do that every time. We walk into a cafe and someone serves us, and in that interaction, it sums them up. So yeah, but as you say, it's not necessarily a stable relationship between that personality traits and behavior.
I really like the not Michelle, can't remember the name of the guy, but he basically says that personality is stable behavior in separate contexts. So, you know, if you have a context of a party, you know, people behavior would be similar to a party in the party, and if they're in a queue, their behavior will be similar when they stand in a queue. So the behavior might change between the queue and the party, but when they're in a particular context, their behavior is quite similar in the similar circumstances. So it's quite a trend. So I thought that was quite fun.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I always saw myself as quite reasonably sort of tolerant and patient, except in one context, which was a football game. If I was coaching on the side lanes, if you came along or others came along and looked at that, I would truly be a psychopath. I think I'd meet all those ingredients. So I really had to work on all the triggers for what was going on when I was in that context. It seemed to get into the root issues of being a working class lad growing up in the East End. All those finer qualities would come out. But another stressful, pressurized situation, big projects, stuff like that, I could be quite relaxed and calm.
Interesting. So there was so you felt maybe psychologically safe in the game to release that side of you that you needed.
Yeah, and also it's about permission, isn't it? But actually, maybe this is what you do.
Yeah, I know. It's like one of my favorite questions was the last time you were yourself, you know, or when was the last time you were happy and stuff like that, to explore this a little bit more. Because this modification of behavior is a blessing and a curse. People who are highly adaptable, especially high conscientious. So if you're highly conscientious, you can manage your behavior for longer because you have more willpower reserves. So you can do stuff you don't like for extended periods of time, which is a blessing when you need to get something over the line, but it's a curse because you can do stuff you don't like for extended periods of time, especially if you're high agreeableness. That's quite a struggle for clients because they don't really know what they want, but they can put up with a lot of crap for a lot of time rather than saying what they want instead. And that can be kind of challenging from its own perspective. But yeah, fun and games. So I'll know if we ever in a football game together, that's the Dean's football personality.
Yeah, make sure you're on the same side, Nikita, not on the opposite side.
I see. So still courteous to them. Excellent. So that's an interesting one about changes, because when we talk about personality, we change, our environment around us changes, but here we're going to focus on how we perceive change. Because to me, why I wanted to give an example of change to finish it up on, because it is very individual based, and now we're all going through a lot of change. So I thought maybe knowing a little bit more would be beneficial. So I'm just curious how you feel about change. So if you can go into Mentimeter and type in 1835040 and just mark, how do you feel about change? So when people say just change, you know, organizational change, moving countries, whatever, how does that make you feel? So if you can go to menti.com, 1835040, and just select whichever you feel fits best. Do you love it? Is it okay? You hate it? No. Change what change?
Nikita, I don't have the poll. I just have the photograph of the beautiful sunset or sunrise and the signposts.
Same here.
Yeah, same here.
Cheeky, Menti, let's do it again.
There
What about now?
I've just got the first option.
What? Menti, you cheeky stuff. Ugh. Any luck?
No.
Yeah, I think I got it, but it's select an option, then you get a scroll
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
option. Yeah,
I
that's
see.
fine.
You only have to put in one answer, so it's okay.
Mm. Mhm. So we have sort of a standard distribution coming out, but love it is a little bit more than hate it, which is probably in line with personalities who would be wanted to attend a random webinar in the afternoon on personality. So a little bit more novelty bias. And the thing when we talk about change and personality is that I really like the following slide. And that's some research that has been done by Michel et al. 2013. So he says, when we're talking about personality, we're talking more as a disposition to see change as more positive or negative. Because the thing is, when people talk about change processes, there's so many factors impacting, communication, budget, time of year, God knows. There's like 101 variables which impact the change process. But personality is a disposition that some people see change as more inherently positive. Some people see it more inherently negative, and most people are in the middle. And this was really important to remember, is this disposition is different. And to me, whenever we talk about change, this is often not taken into consideration, because when they talk about communication to change, they just treat everybody as the same. And it's not true. So for example, some people who are especially highly neurotic, high on openness, they will start with risk. It's just the way they're wired. And you cannot tell them how good it's going to be after the change process is done, because they still need the risk addressed first. So for example, if I'm rolling out a large, let's say what I do is personality assessments, if I roll out a program with like 100+ people, I will always have a webinar before the psychometric link is sent out. Because some people's natural reaction is to be suspicious, and they have every right to be. Some people asking you with a Russian name, complete a psychometric. So what I want to do is that have a session where those people can ask those questions. Like, are you going to sell my data? No, I won't. Is HR going to see it? Nope. Not in this case. And you can put this to bed. But if you don't, that 15% of population will start talking, can start making noises, and they will get more people on board. And then you'll have a wave of resistance. So to me, by treating everybody as an individual at the beginning of a change process and allowing people who start with risk for those risks to be addressed can actually increase chances of success. And rather than treating everybody as an individual. And if you want to read the Michel study, it's pretty good. Just let me know and I'll send you the reference. And then what we also have, just some interesting correlation by Bamberger, gotta love such surnames, found that 11 out of 17 studies in their meta-analysis show an association between organizational change and elevated risk of mental health problems, right? So when you tell people there's organizational change coming, their neuroticism goes up. So people who were average neurotic become more neurotic than average, and people who were low neurotic become a bit higher. So because of this increase in neuroticism, well, usually because of the standard distribution, only top 14 percentiles are more neurotic than most. Basically, you're pushing more, you're increasing that level. So therefore, it becomes even more important to cover the risks first. And what's really important here is this sentence. High neuroticism confers to stress vulnerability. So if your neuroticism rises, you become more vulnerable to stress. Well, no surprises. Propensity to feel negative emotional affect, right? But only when conditions are constructed as threatening, right? So only if neurotic people perceive the conditions in which they're in as threatening, it leads to stress vulnerability. So you can still have this rise in neuroticism when presented with organizational change. But if you tell people, this is, you cover the threatening aspect as much as possible, you give people as many tools as possible to cope, you're actually minimizes the chances that this will derail. And because people high on neuroticism feeling worse about their coping ability as individuals. So therefore, to address this, not through marketing and fancy brochures and change management consultants, which will say everything's going to be gravy and, I will show you the world. No, but address the neuroticisms. And highly extroverts will say, it's fine, it's going to be fine. Well, because they're more extroverted, they say this. They're feeling better about coping. But that should never take away from the value and appreciation we need to give people lower on extroversion, high on neuroticism, and people high on openness, perceiving fewer demands and reporting greater coping capacity. So hypothetically, they can diminish stress appraisal, but I'd have to say if you're high openness and high neurotic, I think that will increase the chances, because you can imagine so many different ways things can go wrong. Because we often think, imagination, it's all about unicorns and all that good jazz, but imagination doesn't judge, man. If you're highly extroverted, low neurotic, high openness, you're probably quite cheery in your imaginations. But if you're high neurotic and high on openness, man, you can imagine all sorts of things that things can go wrong. So yeah, it's something to keep in mind. But, thank you for that little rant. And I got on my little hobby horse. What are your thoughts on this? On this interaction between personality and perception of change? Or change processes you have yourself experienced? Fine, I'll call on Per. Per, what are your thoughts?
I'm thinking about self-fulfilling prophecies, to be honest. So it's sort of, we make our traits confirm what our suspicions are, in a sense.
In what way?
No, but there's something about, we sort of, if we expect certain outcomes, then we're more likely to make that happen, and or say that if we go around saying to ourselves that we're not good at coping, then yeah, that's probably going to come true as well. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at this.
Absolutely, but then we'll search out for information which will confirm our self, or confirm prophecy. Confirmation bias, God bless it. Yeah, it's a delicate balance between appreciating individual differences and not letting them box you in.
And of course, we have that phenomenon that you mentioned, I don't know, sometime this summer or whenever, about also consultants who come in and run these processes, highly extroverted, high openness. So they're probably gonna create a gorge between themselves and the more closed-in neurotic people, right? So there's something about that as well. How do you create an environment for people who find this a bit scary?
Exactly. How you create that lovely psychological safety through respect of different personality traits.
I'm feeling into that dilemma a bit in my current project, how to sort of get the quiet factor floor people to get engaged in a change process when they just want to be left alone.
Or is that a self-fulfilling prophecy there, Per?
Exactly.
Just because they're quiet doesn't mean they want to be left alone.
No. I know. So I'm just like looking at how can you unlock that door, right?
Interesting. So how can you unlock the door and participation of people who appear more quiet during meetings? Any suggestions? Or if you're somebody who generally tends to be quiet in meetings, what helps you to participate? Stella? I noticed you turned your camera.
Yeah, exactly. Call them out.
Call them out, but in what way? Like, Stella, oi, what do you think? Or, how should you call them out?
Yeah, probably it's just asking for some input. Usually, like, it's not that they don't have any thoughts. It's just, it's always waiting for the right moment to say. And usually another extrovert would always go first. So yeah, and then at the end you just leave with, okay, then let's let other two, express their thoughts, and I'll wait for my time. But then, oh well. But yeah, in terms of if someone is more quiet, like good questioning probably is key to get more involvement from them. I'm interestingly talking so much more when when being asked about a question I can talk about. So these are just personal thoughts, but probably there is some science behind it. And silence, because no one really likes silence, so eventually someone would start to talk. Well, I hope that's an input worth to
Absolutely.
share.
Thank you, Stella, for sharing that perspective. I noticed, Amisha, you
Nikita?
also muted yourself. Yes.
Yeah.
To get introverts to contribute to meeting, I've found sending them an agenda beforehand. So it gives them then time to collect their views and thoughts, so you're not putting them on the spot there and then in the meeting, and they're feeling pressured.
Yeah, that's
give
definitely.
Give them some, on this point in the agenda, we'll be doing this, so it'd be useful if you gave some thought to it beforehand. Or words to that
Absolutely.
effect.
Thank you, Adrian. Amisha, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think not from an organization perspective, but just like in sessions like these, when you put on polls and you ask that, okay, if there's someone who's made a very interesting remark, and you just ask them as to what do you mean by that, or just ask them to talk about it, then maybe someone who's silent throughout the session may talk and share, okay, this was their thought behind saying something specific. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So to me, it's a combination of what everybody said. One, be aware of your personality. So I'm a high extrovert, so I sometimes treat introversion as rejection of my awesome ideas, because I'm also quite narcissistic. So when I don't get the whole hoo-ha and people being excited, they go, you hate my idea, we're not friends anymore. So I need to be aware of my knee-jerk reaction. Somebody's quietness is not necessarily rejection. So I need to know of that trigger. Two, absolutely agree with Adrian, pre-work. So for example, if I'm working with a group, and this is what I really enjoy right now about delivering workshops online, because nobody can expect sitting 4 hours behind a freaking desk, like a half-day workshop. I split my workshop 2 hours in advance, 2-hour workshop with a time in the middle, so I can give people homework. So I'll give usually a one-to-one coaching session, and at the end I can give homework for the first session. We can agree on homework, and then from the first session to the second session, people also have homework to try out. So you're actually embedding much more and playing with whatever people are learning. And I find this actually has a much higher degree of effectiveness than even a one-day team workshop. Split it up. And if you want people to be creative and they're more pragmatic, tell them how to be, what they can be creative about. Give them a spec. And even the most pragmatic people, most kind of non-high on openness, can be extremely creative if they're given a spec, they're given why they're doing it, what the impact of this, and given time. Not only will they be creative, they'll also be pragmatic in their creativity, but they need time. And this is where cultural biases of creativity really get on my nerves, because we think creative people is people who come up with a shed load of ideas that quick, and they present all these ideas. But that's not actually creativity. They're just random number generation. While more pragmatic people, when given the right resources, can be creative, even more so. So yeah, it's quite an interesting one. But yeah, calling people out, giving them chance to speak, and far as extroverts speaking first, I also recommend this in couples. If there's a couple, extrovert, introvert, that the extrovert asks the introvert about their day first.
Talking about meetings, what I also found useful is to share the agenda ahead, because then, and the topics you're going to talk about briefly, so even the slides ahead or whatsoever, because then I found that if I have a meeting of some sort and I'm prepared in advance of what I want to say, how I want to say it, then probably I am more communicative rather than, just having random topics coming up.
Exactly.
So you have more, actually, you need to be prepared for a social interaction in that sense.
I know. And God forbid there are two people high on openness in that room and the conversation descends into complete chaos and randomness from any pragmatic perspective. And the two people say, oh, we're just having a great brainstorm. It's like, you're on a different freaking planet, man, to what the meeting's title is. Any other reflection? Yes,
So an introvert once told me, I'm highly extroverted. Introvert once told me that the way she prepares for a meeting is on the way, walking to the meeting, to find one person that she can share her ideas with, so that she has a buddy in the meeting to support her. So it's almost like a quick preparation of sharing ideas so that it's not as frightful in the meeting.
So she gets an ally.
Kind of, yes.
Nice. Quite a collaborative way of going about it. Thank you for that, Loretta.
That's why I use my partner, who's highly extrovert. I would say what he needs to say and he would say it. Yeah, it's a good way to do it. But then if he needs to do something which organization related, then usually get passed down to me.
See, good teamwork there. By the way, if you're interested in introversion, extroversion, Susan Cain's book, Quiet, is really good. And also Brian Little, Confessions of a Passionate Introvert, a TEDx talk is really good. So yeah, that is allowing that expression and people talking about what actually helps them. It being factored in from beginning of a project that I find quite helpful. Involve people sooner rather than later. Excellent. Any other thoughts about change or personality or both?
I'm just curious, with the given situation with COVID around, what's your take on personality and change? Do you think people's personality has changed to a certain extent during the last few months, or has it remained the same? Just a question to the audience here. And Nikita as well. Please go ahead.
Well, that's right. Let's ask the audience first. Or participants. So do you think our personalities have changed? Or your personality has changed?
I don't think that our personalities have changed significantly, personally, but I think maybe some of these things have become a bit exaggerated during these times. So I think from my side, particularly when things were so uncertain and there was a lot of change and we didn't know what was kind of happening on a daily basis, I think probably the neuroticism was a bit exaggerated for me. And actually probably the extroversion for me went down a bit because suddenly I was in a situation of I was in a different country at the time when it was the kind of first lockdowns, and I wasn't allowed outside at all. And so I was kind of stuck inside for 3 weeks. So suddenly when I was allowed out, I started to feel, I feel like I've got a bit of social anxiety going on here, which I'd never really had before. So maybe as I'm saying this, maybe our personalities have changed a little bit as I'm talking about it. But I think, and I feel like that's quite an extreme scenario. So maybe kind of as that we come out of that, I feel myself kind of going back to my norm, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And there is good research about personality change that there is a concept of state and trait. So sometimes state is when you show behaviors associated with particular personality trait, but it's more because of state of the situation you're in, and trait is when it gets to disposition. And it has been shown that if you're in a situation for more than 6 months, which is stressful, your neuroticism goes up more as trait rather than state. And we've been in this 9 months. So technically, I think what's really interesting is that it's not necessarily how much we changed, is the fact we are likely all have a little bit changed. And considering this was a commonly shared human experience, so all kind of pretty much 7 billion of us went through the same experience as a species, which is completely unheard of, is also really interesting what sort of changes have occurred. And if you're interested in this, Lumina is doing research, but I'm sure other publishers are as well. So I think in about 6 to 12 months, we'll find out the studies which are actually showing how much change has happened. But going back to Per's original point about culture, some behaviors are now more acceptable. Like, let's face it, when you saw somebody put hand sanitizer before on their hands, you were like, ooh, OCD, or wearing a face mask, you're like, oh, OCD. Now somebody's not wearing a face mask and not putting hand sanitizer, like, you freaking animal, you're endangering the species. So, you know, to what extent some of the behaviors became more culturally acceptable and what that will have impact on personality. That's going to be really interesting. So, yeah. What are everybody else's thoughts?
Just adding to what Liv was mentioning, I think more of who we are or who we were has actually come out more. So like during the lockdown, we had a lot of, I mean, speaking for myself, I had a lot of time to reflect on myself and become aware of who I am as a person. And so post-lockdown, especially like in the UAE, I know more of who I could have become has come out more. Like I know who I am now more than I was aware of earlier, if that makes sense.
Yes, because we reduced the amount of environments in which we needed to adapt. So
Right,
maybe
yeah.
this kind of allowed us to center ourselves more. But actually, you know, would we want to go back to the same job we were doing before or a workplace? Now we're changed. Because that's the biggest question that, you know, everybody says the future of work, hybrid working, etc. But nobody's talking about the individuals coming back to the office are actually different people than the ones that left 12 months ago. And what exactly is there's going to be impact on this? Nobody knows. So that's a more fun dimension from this perspective. But Chris, you were about to say something.
Yeah, no, you mentioned the fact of these changes. I in some situations, I'm a bit of a believer in regression to the mean. So I wonder how permanent these changes are and whether people will regress to what for them is their mean.
Yeah, well, the question is, do people want to change? You know, people have maybe, as Misha said, about finding yourself. You know, do you want to lose yourself again? Or do people want to kind of go back to the previous selves? That's also quite an interesting question. And is there going to be enough motivation for it? Yeah, fun questions to explore for sure. But yeah, research is going to come out and then we shall see. So just wanted to point out about stability and plasticity on the big five. So most of us have both, but if you just have plasticity, which is all about exploration, people have a novelty bias, so they tend to deal better with change because they actually tend to crave it a little bit because they have a novelty bias. So it's about change and they get more stimulated by it. And some people are a bit more pragmatic and a little bit more down to earth and they're a bit more stability. And it's more about implementation. So you have innovation on this side and implementation on the other. So, and hopefully it's a cycle. But what's really important to remember is that most people have both, but some people are just one on one side or the other. And they're usually, you know, if you have a change champion, it's very likely it's on this side because people are drawn to these positions. And therefore, you know, it's important that if you're working with a change management consultancy, you see the personality profile of their personality profiles and personality profiles of a client. So you have a team built together so you can actually see where's the differences might lie. So some companies do this and, you know, I think it's a good time well spent to get this out into the open. And another key thing is that both sides are appreciated. So as I mentioned in a couple of previous sessions, and I'll mention it again, there's a growth and fixed mindsets. But I always like that you have growth on one side, nothing wrong with that, which is associated with plasticity. But we might want to rebrand fixed as nurturing. Because you have, in order for growth, you need nurture. In order for something to grow, it needs a base. And rather than focusing just on growth and discounting the nurturing side, we're tipping the scales. We present some traits as more favorable than others, and there where the respect is gone. So whenever you implement any program or any personality workshop, I always feel it's really important any models you use celebrate both sides of the coin, and they acknowledge both can be overextended, such as, for example, in overextension or stress response. Yes, too much stability can become fixed when we lose sight of plasticity. And similarly, when we lose sight of stability, we can descend into chaos. So both sides can overplay each other. And that's why it's important we value each other. And any programs that we run value both sides of the coin. Because, for example, from high extroversion, you can perceive introversion as detached and aloof, serious and withdrawn and smothering. Or from, I would go with smothering, I think is detached now. No, detached is here. Doesn't matter. And similarly, from high introversion, you can perceive extroversion as can be alone or needy, overbearing and controlling. Well, one side is just being extroverted, the other side is being introverted. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. And nothing new again, yin and yang, and the whole concept of opposites and balancing each other out. And you need both. So nothing new under the sun, once again. Well, that's pretty much, that's it about change. So what's on your mind? What's your key takeaways? Or what's your questions? Or general thoughts and reflections? Personality can change, and only to an extent. Yep. And the thing is that if you're going to be talking about personality change, make sure you have enough energy to do so, and also have a spotter, because that's what's really important. That if you want to listen more, interrupt less, have more strategic time, ask somebody who knows you well and who interacts with you, for them to, when they notice you doing more of this, such as interrupting less or listening more, to tell you you're doing this, because that would really help you with that encouragement, but also knowing as you're shaping along. And it does take energy. So if you want to listen more, make sure you schedule a meeting in which you need to listen more when you have time, not push it back till 4 p.m. on a Friday. It's about the interaction with each other and how they think of each other. And I think this is one of the key things that psychometric testing pulls you into a false sense of security. And what I mean by this is when you have this lovely portrait in front of you or report, it just exists within this page and you think it exists in isolation, and nothing can be further from the truth because it interacts with so many different factors in the environment. And also change affects people with different personalities differently, though it might be self-explanatory, but it is. So let's say if you have somebody who you feel is resisting change, and they're given this term like resistors, just explore what are they resisting? Well, what's happening there? So treat that with curiosity rather than seeing it as a confrontation.
So I had a question.
Go for it.
So, like, I like change, like I accept change, like I like new situations, but when it comes to coping up with a change, I've observed that it's not really easy for me. So I don't know if I should blame the personality, if I should blame my personality for that, or the situation that I'm in, or anything else. So yeah, what's your take on that?
Well, what's your take on it?
I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out what it is, because I have been through a couple of drastic changes till now, and I realize that it takes me a while to kind of cope up with it and deal with it effectively. But on the other hand, I still do like new situations and to come across new challenges, but then I can't deal with it effectively. So it's like a contrast or a polarity, more of a polarity basically. So yeah.
A very interesting point. So you're attracted to change, but sometimes you can't deal with it when it happens as well as you want it to.
Yeah, basically.
What are people's thoughts on that?
Just because you like something doesn't mean it can't be demanding. So I mean, it's something about it can demand a lot of you, but you can still have a positive attitude towards it. So I'm thinking it's sort of two different things you're mixing together here, I think.
Maybe, yeah.
And some changes are really hard, even though we want to go through them, right? And some changes are easier, and it's easier for us to remember the things that were hard to do rather than the things we just played by ear and that worked out.
Right. Yeah, probably, yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Per. Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I always say that I don't like change, but I moved country twice. I mean, I've lived in two separate countries and I've come back both times, and then I say, oh, well, I don't like change, but then when I get bored with my job, I go look for a new one. So kind of the opposite. I say I don't like it, and then I make all these changes. Maybe I've gone to college 3 times now.
Yeah. That's an interesting one.
We're opposite personalities, perhaps.
Oh, it sounds like you have similarity. I think you both have high openness by the sounds of it. But one is potentially higher on conscientiousness than the other. Because a lot of dissatisfaction, sometimes if you're high on openness, doesn't come from the event. It comes from that you imagined it be different. So if you're high on openness and a bit competitive, quite often clients with such profiles compare their performance to how they imagined it. So when you go into a change process and you go, okay, this is how it's going to go. And then when it actually starts happening, it's not in line with how you imagined it. And when you reach the end, you go, well, this was crap, because it's not how you imagined it in the first place. And you go, it's all my fault. I don't like change. Ooh, can't help myself. Gonna do some change again. Because it's actually been more realistic. Like, just because it's not the way you imagined it doesn't mean it's bad.
Mm-hmm. Like,
Or let's
more
say,
like setting realistic expectations out of anything, basically.
well, if you're high on openness and low on pragmatism, it's really hard to have realistic expectations. But it's more because part of having this idea, it stimulates you. It's actually people high on plasticity have been shown to have a more active dopaminergic system. And by the way, dopamine doesn't make you feel good. Dopamine makes you feel on edge. It's internal opiates you release that make you feel good. I only found this out 3 months ago, so I can sound all clever and stuff. But actually, I was making the same mistakes that dopamine is a feel-good chemical for like years. But basically, when presented with a potential reward, the dopaminergic system gets more excited. So, and then you kind of feel on edge. And the idea is, because you get excited by this idea, then you go and pursue it. So it increases your motivation. So sometimes if you're high on openness and a bit of extroversion, sometimes this idea itself as a driver is the carrot that you pursue. It's just sometimes when you pursue this carrot, it turns out it was an aubergine and you go, damn it. But, you know, you still got something. So it's quite an interesting dynamic, especially with people high on plasticity.
Yeah, and also within innovation, there's a lot of people who sort of thrive in the space up until things start to manifest. So if you know that you're going to reach your goal, then they start losing interest and someone else takes over. So it's so important to understand, because and then some people can like start feeling bad about not being so engaged anymore, and they're thinking they're crap at the process, but really it's about where is your driver in all of this, and make sure you have people around you to take over the next part of that journey, and be open about it. Because I've also experienced, this is something that is familiar to me as well. So I've had people think that I don't care anymore, because sort of the first stages where you go from thin air to creating something solid and sort of, and then going into the regular routine of things, then I lose interest, and people think I don't care anymore. It's not that I don't care, but it's sort of, then it's beyond sort of my driving force, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. takes the spice away. But this is what's really important, is that when you talk about a project as a team, even appreciating that different people are excited at different places and seeing it as a relay race to pass it along. So if you're really high on plasticity, you're much better in chaos and ambiguity. But if you ask your pragmatic colleagues, they'll probably say you're one of the causes of the chaos and ambiguity. But basically, you go out into the ether and you fathom an idea, you create a crystal sphere out of ambiguity. But then you get bored and you go, whoops, poof, smash to the floor, because you're bored. So the question is, how do you make sure that the sphere is passed on to people who are really pragmatic in a way they can understand, so they can make something concrete out of this as a blueprint? But this is what's often missing, because let's say if you're highly big picture, not pragmatic, you think you're logical, but it's your own logic. So sometimes when you try to explain it to somebody else who's more pragmatic, you go A, D. When you're a D, you go, I don't need to mention B and C. It's freaking self-explanatory. Your mind post-rationalizes your decision tree. And then you go X, Z, any questions? Good, I'm clear, done, out. And then you bugger off, pardon my French. And then you're like, oh my God, they're not doing what I expected them to do. They're ruining my great idea. Well, maybe they actually didn't understand. You might as well be speaking a different language when you were presenting. You know, when you talk with highly innovative people, you just say, sometimes you present your ideas and you think they're brilliant, but then they're not implemented. And they go, yeah. And I go, what happens then? Well, I go with another creative to the pub and we say how this organization is going down the drain because they're not innovating. And how long's been happening? Month. Well, maybe this is not the best coping strategy here. So yeah, it's quite fun. By the way, they discovered recently, like 2 years ago, people higher on openness, they seem to have denser neuron connectivity in their corpus callosum. So what connects their hemispheres? So there's just more neurons there. They're more densely packed. So maybe this is actually explains random ideas, because, you know, neurons sometimes just spark off each other because of proximity. I'm not a neuroscientist. I have no idea what I'm talking about right now, but it seems face valid to me. So I just thought this was quite interesting, that sometimes this idea, and our logic post-rationalizes. This is what we know from split brain patients. So, you know, you have an idea and then you come up with why you had it, potentially. So it's quite a fun area. Mm-hmm. Oh, our extroverts feel better about coping because there's a link between extroversion and resilience. Yes, but it depends. So for example, if you're a highly extroverted, low neurotic, you're more resilient. But that's because a lot of resilience tools look at your emotional state. But you're more resilient to the point. So as Gordon Curfey, an interesting chap, he says, basically neuroticism, if you think about it, when it comes to stress, is the size of the fuse. So it's how much stress you can put up with. Higher neuroticism, the shorter the fuse before you explode, right? So with high neuroticism, people have a longer fuse, but it doesn't mean they don't explode. It just takes more to get them going. So let's say they'll be chilled and optimistic with everything until their partner leaves for South Africa because they feel unhappy in their marriage and they thought things were just going just fine. They already planned their retirement and all of this. And they really get knocked down. But the issue with this is that because they're low neurotic, high extroversion, they don't have the tools to cope with negative emotions that a high end neurotic who's used to it has. So they might become really kind of taken back by negative emotions they're feeling because they're new to them. And B, what's really kind of problematic is culturally and friendship groups. Because in friendship groups, they're usually seen as the most resilient ones. So people go, they'll be fine. So they're not likely to reach out because they see that resilient, extroverted person and go, they'll be fine. But actually, it's the people who sometimes need help the most because they don't know what's happening. They feel really down and they don't know how to cope with this. And people are not likely to reach out to them because they're seen as a resilient one. So if you have a friend like that, or something really bad happens, do reach out to them because they might really need it. So sometimes the people who we perceive as the most resilient ones need help the most. Does that answer your question about resilience?
Thank you.
You're welcome, Adrian. But also, when you look at resilience measures, just look at the items And if they measure how happy you are or how positive or how optimistic you are, that's high extroversion. Because let's say a highly neurotic introvert who scores low on positive emotional impact measures can still be content and still be productive. But if you measure them by a happy yardstick, they're going to score low on this, but doesn't mean they're not happy. It's just, it's impacted by their personality. So this is why it's really important when you look at engagement surveys and all of this. What are we exactly measuring? Because engagement surveys, up to 50 to 60% of variance on people's answers on some engagement surveys, as shown by research, can be explained by the difference in their personality. Highly extrovert, low neurotics are happy with pretty much everything, and especially as they're high agreeableness, God bless them. And high neurotic, high introverts, low agreeableness are unhappy with a lot of stuff. So to what extent we're measuring engagement and to what extent we're measuring personalities, this is why it's important to measure both and see where the differences are. Changes on the good ones.
There's also something a few years ago that said that highly engaged, that people who score highly on engagement surveys often fall into the category of being underperformers whose performance isn't managed properly. In other words, they're given an easy time.
Oh, fascinating, Adrian. And when you read this paper, did it seem legit to what you see in the workplace? Or you were thinking, what the hell is this?
I think where it struck me as being legitimate was where people underperform in teams. If you look at sales teams where performance is very explicit, I certainly know high-performing salespeople get very disengaged if the underperformers are not managed appropriately.
Mm.
And I've struggled for a long time to find the paper, and I still can't find it. But it contradicted a lot of things that the Gallup polls were proving.
Mm.
It said just because you have high engagement doesn't mean you have a high-performing organization. What it means is you might not be managing people's performance appropriately.
Yeah, and what questions are you asking? Like recently I saw, it wasn't any big consultancy, but it was an independent person created this. And it says, I'm very happy with how my manager handled the COVID situation. That was the item. And it was strongly agree as the first two items answers. And I was like, that's a loaded question if I ever saw one.
Mm.
So, it looks good for management, but does it give you a real measure? I was recently creating a survey with a clinical psych, and that was really interesting, looking at mental health. And basically I said, how's your mental health? Good, bad. And he says, actually, we need to change this. We'll go at my best to at my worst, because this good, etc. is not as good as these two. So it's like, wow, there's just so much you can go into in the ways those items are written to begin with.
Oh, it just reminds me of an engagement survey I've done myself back in a few years ago. And as the items were, it was interesting because, like usually one or the lowest is on the left-hand side, and, the top mark is on your right-hand side, and it was switched around.
Interesting. Yeah, it's little things like this that can make all the difference. And this is why whenever you use a psychometric, whenever you use an engagement survey, always look at the items. And if they don't make sense to you, they might not make sense to your client. And I'm always surprised that people get trained in psychometrics, but they don't know the items they're asking their clients. This is always quite a surprise to me. Because ultimately...
The other thing I saw stellar in engagement surveys was whether the people taking part believe in the organization's assurances that it's anonymous. And if they don't, you're bound to get a really good engagement survey, because nobody's going to say this is a shower of doodah, because they think, oh, it's going to be traced back to me and, I'm going to be hounded or punished in some shape or form. So, yeah, I think I've started becoming cynical about them. Sorry, not started. I am cynical about them. Yeah.
But now you found some research to support it, so you're evidence-based cynical.
I found it and then lost it, Nikita. That's what's really damn frustrating. It was a few years ago when I used to give organisation, or my organisation, parts of my organisation, feedback on their biannual engagement survey.
I'm sure we can find it again. Just
Please,
go to
if you
Google.
do, I'll be over the moon. Yeah.
Great. Next time I can't sleep, I'll make sure to search for it, because that's what I do. I go to Google Scholar and I look for randomness. What did I find? Oh man, there's just so much randomness if you type in Big Five and latest research.
I guess engagement surveys can be, a good source of information if they are used well and done well. But other than that, if it can be just really, just a nice to have, if, or just like an ornament, if it's not actually implemented on, or, it's like the information is there, but no one really does anything about it. I think that was one of the perception as well, which people needed to manage in that organization.
What the point?
Yeah, my company started doing them every 2 years as opposed to every year, because they said there wasn't enough time between people completing it, the results being produced, the results being analysed, the results being fed back, and management having time to put any changes in place before, hey ho, the next one came along. And so they did them every 2 years.
Nice. So
my I think somewhat radical suggestion was, if we believe in the Latin in vino veritas, then staff should be encouraged to have some alcohol before they filled it in. Take it to the pub, get them loose, and then take them back into an office and get them to fill the engagement survey in. Yeah, you probably couldn't read a word that they'd written or anything like that, but it might be a bit more representative. Just a thought.
Then we need to definitely watch the positive language of the survey, because alcohol increases extroversion. So yeah, but that's an interesting combination: alcohol and engagement surveys. Something to take away.
I bet if you do a search on that one, Nikita, you might not get so many results.
Actually, there is quite a bit of alcohol consumption and Big Five research out there. So, but not engagement surveys.
Not engagement surveys.
Not engagement surveys. But yeah, so that's a bit of fun. Right. So on that note, it's what you do with this information that counts, and the psychological contract of what's going to happen with it. But the main thing is, what's engagement surveys, personality, it applies similarly. Look at the items, why the people doing it, and the psychological contract is also important. Well, on that note, we kind of went to engagement surveys, and it might be a topic for another lecture, because there's a whole avenue to explore. By the way, there are some similarities between how people score on engagement surveys and marriage satisfaction. So definitely something to look into there as well. And so on that note, good people, thank you so much for your participation. I'm just gonna stop the share and stop the recording. So recording stopped.